Slide.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Simon Jackman. I'm Professor of Political Science and the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Welcome to Foundation Hall here in Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art in Circular Quay. Welcome to Howard on Trump, a very special event for the United States Study Centre. Indeed, as I'll venture and elaborate in just a second, I think an important event for the nation. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge some distinguished guests. The Honourable Justice Michael Lee of the Federal Court of Australia, Mr. John Alexander, the member for Bennelong, Mr. Howard's Patch, and the House of Representatives, Ms. Valerie Fowler, Consul General of the United States, Mr. Hideki Matsuo, Consul General of Japan, Mr. Sergei Shipilov, Consul General of the Russian Federation, Mr. John Olson, who's done everything, former Premier of South Australia, former Senator for South Australia, former Consul General for Australia in New York and Los Angeles, Chair of the America-Australia Association in the Perth US-Asia Centre, Mr. Dennis Richardson, former Australian Ambassador to the United States, among other things, Mr. Rawdon Dalrymple, former Australian Ambassador to the United States, Mr. David Ritchie, former Ambassador to France, colleagues from the University of Sydney, the registrars here, Tyrone Carlin, the Dean of the Law School at the University, Professor Jolyn Riley, Professor Don Nutbeam, along with Professor Alan DuPont, who's here, pivotal to the establishment of the United States Study Centre. Great to have you with us tonight. Mark Bailey, Chair of the Board of the US Study Centre, Greg Metcalf from the board, thank you, all of you, for being with us tonight. On at least 2 or 3 occasions in the last year, I've had the honour of noting John Howard's presence at an event convened by the United States Studies Centre, typically his name in the list of dignitaries I acknowledge at the top. Most recently, at an address by Senator John McCain at the State Library just a few weeks ago, and tonight we get to turn that around. Tonight, Mr. Howard is the star of the show, so to speak. Mr. Howard is typically introduced as Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. And tonight, what's relevant about that remarkable accomplishment is that Mr. Howard's tenure as Prime Minister coincided with a remarkably turbulent time in international affairs and in the United States in particular. If we even turn the clock just a little bit back further, it's worth noting John Howard was elected to the House of Representatives in May of 1974. That parliament that he first sat in met in July, in the final weeks of what turned out to be the last month of Richard Nixon's presidency. John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996, halfway through Bill Clinton's presidency. Mr. Howard's first year as Prime Minister saw a sitting US President impeached by the House of Representatives, only the second time in history that's happened, tried by the Senate and acquitted. In 2000, Mr. Howard, like the rest of us, witnessed a remarkable US election, one that produced a mismatch between the popular vote and the Electoral College. The last time that happened, of course, was 2016, and it was a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court that settled the matter. Mr. Howard, of course, was in Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001, and experienced the shock of that day as an eyewitness, as a participant. And anyone who's heard Mr. Howard speak of his experience that day understands the impression it made on him as a person, but also as an incumbent Prime Minister of one of America's closest allies. Now, averaged over the 8 years of the presidency of the United States, George W. Bush was not a popular president in the United States, and possibly even less popular here in Australia. And it was Mr. Howard's stewardship of Australia's relationship with the United States, working with the Bush administration through the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, that proved a profound test of his statesmanship and his political leadership. And there are clear parallels between those times and now, with the presidency of Donald Trump and reactions to it putting the Australia-US relationship under enormous scrutiny, if not outright stress. And that's why I claim that tonight is so important, not just for those of us in the room tonight, but for the entire nation. Because in not just defence and intelligence, but in investment, in financial services, in science and technology, in the creative industries, in realms such as philanthropy and social entrepreneurship, in realm after realm, the United States remains Australia's most important partner, and frankly by a mile. There's so much at stake for Australia in that relationship, so much at risk if we misread what Trump's presidency means for the US and for Australia. That's why Mr. Howard's insight tonight will be so valuable, and that's why the United States Study Centre is so proud to be hosting this event. When we began planning this event, there was only one choice as to who the interlocutor could be, and that's Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large for The Australian, quite simply Australia's most authoritative columnist, an astute observer of the US-Australia relationship. I think of Paul as a triple threat. He writes with insight, analytical rigour, but at a crushing tempo, and he's been doing it for decades. And if journalism is the first draft of history, then Australian historians find themselves at a terrible disadvantage having to follow Paul Kelly's work. Thank you for being with us tonight, Paul. Tonight, Mr. Howard and Paul will be in conversation for about half an hour, and then we'll open up for roughly 15 to 20 minutes of questions from the floor that Paul will direct traffic on that, and we've got microphones roaming for that part of proceedings. For now, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand it over to Paul for Howard on Trump.
Thank you, Simon. John Howard, thank you for agreeing to this conversation, Howard on Trump. Let's start with the election. Let's start at the beginning. Were you surprised at Donald Trump's election victory over Hillary Clinton?
Yes, I was. I, along with most other people, expected Hillary to win. Why? Because most of the polls suggested that that was going to be the case. Most of the commentary did. Foreign affairs commentators in Australia that I admired predicted it, and I thought that Trump's style would not please a lot of Americans. I think in the end he won because of accumulated disillusionment by a hollowed-out American middle class.
Would you have voted for Trump, or would you have voted for Clinton?
I'd have found it very difficult to make a decision. I would normally favour a Republican, but I'm not going to walk away from some of the critical comments I made.
How deep were your reservations about Trump?
They were quite deep. I used the expression that I trembled at the thought. I mean, I don't believe in walking away from what I said, because it's on the record.
Well, if you trembled at the thought, presumably that means that you would have probably voted for Clinton against Trump.
Yeah, well, John, you're the commentator, Paul. You do it very well. Look, I am by nature in American politics a supporter of the Republican side. And I don't disguise that fact. But there were things about his campaign that I didn't like. I didn't like the attack on free trade. I didn't like the promise to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but of course Hillary Clinton would have done the same thing. And I thought some of his rhetoric about economic affairs was very bad. But he won. And along with everybody else, we've got to accept that. And I think one of the problems with American politics now is there are too many people in America who still don't accept the outcome of the election. And they've got to get over that. And politics is full of substance and style. And the style of President Trump is unusual, it's different. There's no point in saying otherwise, but that shouldn't blind us to the substance of his presidency. And he's done a number of things as president that I think are very praiseworthy. I think his handling of Syria was, in comparison with his predecessor, outstanding. I mean, he's somebody who did something when somebody crossed a red line he had not identified. And I think the reaction of the world to that particular event was predictably very good.
You referred to the divisions in the United States about Trump. To what extent do you think this is a pretty fundamental problem? Because since the election, those divisions have intensified. There's chronic talk about impeachment of the president. Do you think that American influence and American power in the world is being undermined by the extent of the polarisation in US domestic politics?
There's always been polarisation in American politics. There was enormous polarisation under President George W. Bush. There was polarisation under Ronald Reagan.
But surely it's a lot worse now.
I think it's too early to call that. One of the things that I would urge everybody to do is to remember that it's only, 7 months? Well, it's less than 7 months since he was sworn in as president. I mean, hang on. I can think of people who were doing spectacularly well as heads of government in their first 7 months, and they ended up out on their ear in less than 2.5 years. And you really have to be very, very careful to call these things too quickly. And can I just say that when you talk about the decline in American power, with the greatest of respect to the previous president of the United States, the decline in America's influence in the world during the Obama administration was very marked, to say the least. And I think we are still paying a very heavy price in relation to places such as the Ukraine and Crimea and the Middle East. I mean, I've never forgotten President Obama's West Point commencement speech of 2014, in which he virtually, at the very least, inferred that the administration regarded as the Islamic terrorist threat as in retreat. And yet within a very short period of time out of that, we had IS bursting out of Syria and parts of Iraq.
Now, I understand your critique of President Obama, but are you actually suggesting that you think that American power will be enhanced and gain greater authority under President Trump?
I think it's too early to make a call on that, Paul. I think it's a curatek. I think some of the things that Trump has done on the international stage have been unsettling.
What are those things?
Well, talk of trade sanctions moves against China are very unsettling for the world. He is a little bit unpredictable on that. He has retreated from the 45% tariff rhetoric, and I welcome that. And this is very important to our own country, because freer world trade is an article of faith, or ought to be an article of faith for Australia. It certainly is for the Turnbull government, and I welcome that. On the other hand, he seems to have toned down some of the anti-Chinese trade rhetoric, and that is a very good thing. I thought his early attacks on the intelligence services were very unwise. Ronald Reagan, who set the gold standard, in my view, for a conservative American president, would never have made those sorts of attacks, neither indeed would Margaret Thatcher.
Well, can we try and deconstruct this a little bit? You talked earlier on about having reservations about Trump's style. You've now raised doubts about some of his policies as president. What do you think is the fundamental problem? Is it a question of style, or is it a question of substance, or is it both?
Well, I think it's more the things about him that disconcert people are more on the style side. If you actually look at the substance, after a hesitant start, he's reaffirmed NATO, he reaffirmed the One China policy. He seems to be doing things to maintain a good relationship with European countries. I think when it comes to Europe, he's to be applauded for calling out the Europeans on defence spending. The Europeans have been coasting on American defence spending for decades, and for them to lecture the Americans about security matters, given that America has carried most of the defence expenditure for so many years, is just a bit rich He's been a lot more conventional in some of his foreign policy forays. There was a very good piece in Foreign Affairs by Elliot Abrams a few weeks ago saying that beneath the surface he'd actually been quite conventional. But his style is different in the tweeting.
Well, I wonder if it's just...
And we have to look through, you've got to look through the style, because I don't think he's going to change.
Okay, you talk about style, but is it something else? Is there a problem of character? It seems to me that when you look at what other world leaders are saying, that they're disconcerted not just by Trump's style as president, they have reservations about his character. Look at what Chancellor Merkel has said. Look at what the new president of France, President Macron, has said. The clear impression is they don't trust Trump as president and they think he's not a reliable president.
Well,
what's your response to that critique?
Well, to start with, I think the new president of France, with all due respect, and I congratulate him on his outstanding victory, with all due respect, he's got to earn a few stripes before he can start marking an American president. And I mean, he hasn't got off to a good start by sort of blaming climate change for terrorism, which he apparently did in a speech. So I think the Europeans have got a problem with the United States when in relation to their priorities. The Europeans obviously place a much higher premium on climate change than do the Americans, but this has been the case for decades. As I remember rightly, the American Senate under the Clinton administration voted overwhelmingly, 97-0 or something or other, to reject the Kyoto Protocol. There's nothing new about America and Europe being divided on climate change, and I take with a little scepticism European criticism of the United States.
Well, on this question of climate change and the Paris Agreement, do you think Trump did the right or wrong thing indicating that he wanted to withdraw the United States from the agreement?
Well, I think he did what he was always going to do. I have become, I have to confess, I have become increasingly more of a sceptic on climate change. I have to confess that. I don't think I was ever a paid-up enthusiast but I think I have become a little more sceptical, and I think the path forward does lie very heavily on the side of investing overwhelmingly in top quality technology, but that's another issue, and we haven't got time for it tonight. But I just think what Trump has done is entirely predictable. The Europeans should have known that Trump was going to do this, given the things that he said in the election campaign.
Well, let's talk about trade. Trump has really torpedoed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course President Obama made it clear that that wasn't just a trade deal, that was a strategic deal about the United States' role in Asia. How concerned are you about what's happened to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how concerned are you about Trump's global trade policies and the risks they might involve?
Well, I'm still not sure what his global trade policy is. Now, if that is interpreted as a criticism, well, so be it. I think it's still to be seen what his global policy is.
Well, let's talk about the Trans-Pacific
Partnership.
I
think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a great concept. I don't believe it can be brought to fruition without the participation of the Americans. I think the Turnbull government is quite right to try. It's a demonstration of their very good faith on these matters, and that's very important with other countries in the region. But I think it's a big disappointment that the Americans have pulled out of that. But let's not have a nervous breakdown just on that one issue. I think it's the broader relationship with China in the trade area that matters most of all, because it's long been my view that the most important bilateral relationship in the world by a long way is that between the United States and China, and how in the long run Trump handles that relationship. And it has appeared to oscillate a bit. I thought he got off to a very good start. And it's very critical, of course, in relation to North Korea, because it's any understanding about how to handle North Korea that is reached between the United States and China that is the most important thing. I think all of this reporting about how it was a huge setback that the G20 didn't say anything about North Korea. The G20 was never in a position to say anything about North Korea. G20 is overwhelmingly an economic gathering.
Well, how do you think the North Korean issue should be addressed? Is this essentially an issue that needs to be sorted out between primarily China and the United States?
Well, there are other countries that have an interest in it, but they're the two nations that can together bring, or acting separately but with an understanding of each other, that can bring the greatest pressure to bear. It is a very challenging issue, and it is the number one security issue in a global sense that we have at the present time.
But I mean, do you think the Chinese will come on board? I mean, Trump's raised the stakes here. He's said that he expects China to address the issue. So far, the Chinese haven't done all that much. How confident are you that at the end of the day that China will respond and address the North Korean issue in a more resolute way?
Look, I'm not confident at all, Paul, but the alternatives to not trying to get the Chinese to bring more pressure to bear are even less, far less palatable. I mean, nobody is interested or enthused by some kind of military solution, although, as the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia quite rightly said, it's not something that can ever be taken off the table, but we all understand the juxtaposition of North Korean military hardware on South Korea, and we all understand the implications of any military operation that went wrong. So while you can't take it off the table, nobody is cheering for some kind of military option. The device that was used for many years of the six power talks, that hasn't got anywhere. And in the end, the capacity of the Chinese to bring pressure to bear on North Korea is still greater. But the Chinese may have a greater difficulty with North Korea than we perhaps allow for.
If you look at
a
what's
little bit
happened,
like years and years ago, different circumstances, the Soviet Union and Tito-led Yugoslavia, they had their independence. They were part of the orbit, but it wasn't always easy to bring them into line.
one of my concerns is that Trump is likely to lack the consistency and the astuteness to manage Russia and China, to manage the Russian president, to manage the Chinese president. I don't see any sign that he's got the coherence or capacity to do that. Do you have similar fears or not?
I think it's too early again, Paul, and we've got to allow for the growing influence that could be brought to bear by the Secretary of State. I mean, the Secretary of State is a very able man. He was extremely successful in business. He's had a quiet start, but that's perhaps a good thing. I think you've got to allow more time. There are a lot of appointments in the State Department yet to be made, and obviously they should be made as soon as possible. But I do think that there's a rush to judgment on this bloke, on Trump, which is understandable because he's so powerful.
But he invites the rush to judgment,
I
doesn't he?
understand that, but then we've got to be careful we don't fall for the trap of rushing to judgment. He can...
You mean we shouldn't fall into the invitation that he's extending to us?
Well, that's a good way of putting it, yes. Full marks for the phraseology, but absent something quite extraordinary, he's there for 4 years.
Well, can I ask, do you think he should stop tweeting?
Well, look, he's not going to, and for me to say he ought to, it's not going to change anything. I mean, you know, I'd like to think I could actually bring about a change in his behaviour, but look, he's not going to. Look, we ought to accept he's different and in his style. Now, in the long run, and I mean, he's different when he deals with people internationally. Obama dealt with people internationally in the way everybody sort of expected in an orthodox way an American president should. But did that mean at the end of his 8 years in office, American power, prestige and influence was greater than it was at the beginning? I'm not sure.
If you were Prime Minister dealing with Trump, how would you manage him?
Well, I think so far I'd take a few pages out of Malcolm Turnbull's playbook. I think Malcolm Turnbull's handled him very well. I think Malcolm Turnbull came out of the exchange over the Manus Island deal as somebody who was sticking up for the Australian national interest. And that's what a Prime Minister should do, and I give him 10 out of 10 for that.
Now, one of the outstanding commitments of Trump, of course, is his famous America First slogan. And there's a lot embodied in this. Trump, of course, is the leader of the United States with a whole series of global responsibilities. How concerned are you that we've got a President of the United States operating by an America First slogan?
I'm not as concerned as the simplicity of the statement should suggest. I think that is essentially a statement for home front consumption. And
you don't think that's a guide to how he's operating in the world as president?
I don't think it is I don't think it means what people automatically think it means. And you do have to understand, if I can go back to the Europeans, you've got to understand the history of America's relations with Europe since World War II have been where the Americans have carried the Europeans on defence. They've filled the gap left by the Europeans in the disintegration of the old Yugoslavia. I can understand the constituency that is Middle America feeling on occasions that an American president should put his own country first. I can understand that. Now, I don't believe in the end he's going to do that in a way that will damage basic alliances. I mean, he hasn't really walked away from countries that are very close to the United States historically. Britain, he's going to the Bastille Day celebrations in Paris. He's, I think, developed at a very early point a good relationship with the Japanese. He did the right thing by Australia in relation to Manus Island. He may have grumbled about it.
Well, we're still waiting for the formal announcement.
Yeah, but it's part of his domestic handling of it. I mean, look, if you're a paid-up supporter of Trump in the Middle West, and you were talking about a travel ban on people, and then you learnt that he had this agreement with Australia, and we were going to, send to America people who had arrived in Australia in ambiguous circumstances, you can understand that those paid-up supporters feeling a little bit underwhelmed. And I think that all worked out precisely as you might expect it to.
Are you concerned about how he might handle a crisis? I mean, as you say, it's the early days of the presidency yet, but every president, or virtually every president at some stage or other, has to take a really critical decision in a crisis. Given his inexperience as a politician, given his lack of consistency, given his unpredictability, how do you approach this issue in terms of Trump's capacity to manage a crisis?
Well, I can understand why that question gets asked. I suppose the only field evidence we have so far is his handling of the missile strike on Syria. Now, the most serious thing you ever do is to authorise the military forces of your country to use lethal force. And the one and only occasion I think he's done that is in relation to Syria. And just about everybody applauded what he did.
What's the conclusion that you draw from that? Do you think this is a president who'll be reluctant to use military force, or do you think he might be far more prepared to use it than many of us might suspect?
Well, if you look at the circumstances of his use of it in relation to Syria, I think he got the balance right. You don't want a president who is reckless in using American military power, but you also don't want a president who is reluctant to use it, particularly when warnings have been given that consequences will flow.
Going back to China, are we in a situation where President Trump has really just now got to accept the status quo in relation to the South China Sea and Chinese militarisation of those islands in the South China Sea? Is that the new status quo or not?
Look, I think if you push me on that, probably yes. I've said before that I think that we could have the tension over the South China Seas for many years into the future, and we've had that before. There was different circumstances, but there was tension between the United States and China over the offshore islands and surrounding near Taiwan many years ago, and it just may be that what the world has got to do is avoid a confrontation over the South China Seas. I don't think the Chinese see a confrontation as being in their interests. I think we underestimate the internal challenge the Chinese government has in managing the economic transition that is taking place there. I think we underestimate the preponderance of American power over the Chinese for decades into the future. I am a person who believes we've got to avoid being mesmerised by Chinese power. China's got two huge challenges. One of them, of course, is the demographic challenge, and the other is that my belief that eventually, when you have hundreds of millions of people who have been born into relative affluence in a country, they're going to want more say in running their lives. You might put up with being told what to do if you've transitioned from poverty to wealth, or poverty to relative wealth, but you won't do it if you're born into it. So I think, and just remember that on the last analysis I read, even by the year 2013, the per capita GDP of an individual citizen of China will be somewhere akin to what it is in Greece at the present time, and we've just got to be very careful. I can remember some years ago when people were writing books about the end of the American century, in comparing American power with Japanese, the rise of Japanese economic power, and so I put an answer to that question about the South China Seas in the context of the relationship between the two countries.
Well, let me just deal now then with our relationship with both the United States and China. Given that America is our principal alliance partner, can we really trust Donald Trump?
Well, I think the answer to that is, given the accumulated history of the two countries, yes.
Do we need to take out some sort of policy insurance? Because we're uncertain about Trump? Do we need to alter our strategic settings with America because we're concerned about a Trump factor? Now, I ask that question because, as you know, that's precisely what a number of prominent Australians in our public debate argue that we ought to do.
Well, I'm not one of them, and I think the answer to that is no. I think the two relationships can stand alone and separate. And don't underestimate the sophistication of the Chinese understanding of the depth and the history of our relationship with the United States. My experience in government was the Chinese understood beneath the surface. They understood why we were close to the United States. They understood the history. And correspondingly, the Americans understand the deep economic and in growing person-to-person investment we have in our relationship with China. I am an anti-having to choose man when it comes to this argument that we've got to make a choice between the United States and China is so, if any government gave effect to that, they'd be doing immense damage to this country's future. I mean, we will always be closer to the United States because we share common values, and values bind nations together more tightly than anything else. But, China has been extremely valuable to us economically. We have a growing people-to-people relationship, particularly here in the city of Sydney, and we should continue to build on that relationship. But we mustn't, this idea that you take out insurance because you think your best friend is going to rat on you, no, that's not for me.
Well, can I ask you then, do you think it's a long-run strategic objective of China to dissociate Australia from this close alliance relationship we have with America?
I don't think it's anywhere near. I mean, it might be something that some people in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs would write a paper about, but China's key objectives are a lot more prosaic than that. They are concerned about continued economic growth. They're concerned about the internal balancing of the newly enriched with the still in poverty. They are concerned about, they're more directly concerned about difficult relationships with neighbouring countries. I mean, the Chinese relationship with Japan is still fraught, although it's better, but it's still very difficult. And of course, they don't seem to be winning too many hearts and minds in Hong Kong at the present time. So I would hesitate to believe that the Chinese are working overtime on trying to separate Australia from the United States. I think they would have concluded that that's never going to happen, and they would be planning accordingly.
Now, you've given a very powerful answer earlier on, saying you believe that Australia can trust Donald Trump as president, can trust Donald Trump as an alliance partner.
To preserve the alliance.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's not going to say, he's going to do everything
well,
we would like him to do.
This is precisely the question I'm about to come to.
But you could say that in relation to any American president.
Sure. So this leads to the question I was intending to ask. Where then, within the context of that answer, do you think the main risks are for Australia's relationship with the Trump administration? What are the areas of risk and vulnerability for us?
Well, I think they lie in the area of trade. But they always have. I can remember when President George H.W. Bush came to Australia. Bob Hawke was Prime Minister then, I think. No, I think he'd just been removed. But he'd made arrangements.
Paul Keating was PM.
Paul Keating had just taken over.
Yep.
Only a couple of weeks before. But the big issue then was how America was going to respond to the anger of Australian farmers. I had more arguments with Bill Clinton about lamb than anything else. I mean, we've always had trade problems with the Americans, and because you have a clash of sectoral interests, and we will worry. I mean, there was talk. Apparently, the Australian government, through Matthias Cormann and others, had taken some preemptive action or discussions against the possibility of the Americans imposing steel tariffs. Well, we had that problem. They imposed steel. The Bush administration imposed steel tariffs, and I can remember. We were very angry about it, and we did a lot of things. And my good friend Dennis will probably remember it, although I think it was a bit before his time. He's very familiar with it, and we worked very hard. And they found a it didn't happen. That's the point I'm making. Why didn't it happen? Because of the relationship. Now, I think we will have arguments with the Trump administration on trade, just as we have had arguments with the the Bush administration and prior to that the Clinton administration, and because our interests won't always coincide on those issues.
Okay, my penultimate question, do you think that in 3.5 years' time Donald Trump will still be president, or do you think there's a prospect that he might be impeached in the interim?
No, I think he'll still be president.
He'll still be president?
Yes, I do. I really do. I mean, I don't pretend to be an expert on the American constitutional process, but I can't conceive of there being any other outcome.
And do you think he'll be a successful president?
I think it's too early to tell, Paul. I think people who are writing him off now are foolish, and a lot of the people who are doing that, still can't sort of accept that they lost, I mean, it happens, and I think that the key to Trump's political future, which is obviously domestic, lies very much on how successful he is in meeting the expectations of the people who supported him. And if the American middle class is still seeing its wages decline and its jobs disappearing, well, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And I come back to the point I made at the beginning. I think the major reason Trump won was not because a whole lot of people flocked to a banner of a new conservatism. I don't think that was the case at all, because in some respects he didn't behave like an American conservative, but I think you've got this deep deprivation that middle-class Americans feel in many parts of the country, and to enough of them, Hillary Clinton represented a continuation of the same old, and I think that was critical to the outcome of the election.
Now we will now go to the audience for a question and answer session with the audience. There are mics on the floor, so if people can indicate by putting their hand up, and we want people to ask a pertinent, precise question, not give a speech. And I see a gentleman over there.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. You seem to have equivocated a lot on...
I wonder if people could indicate who they are at the start of their question.
And could you speak clearly, because I'm a bit deaf?
Certainly.
Literally.
My name's Alex Sell, and I'd like to ask you whether you unequivocally condemn what Donald Trump has said about women, about migrants, and about people from certain religions. It seems that you have put a lot of that down to style, but it seems to go a lot further than that.
Oh, look, I thought some of the comments he made in the campaign about women were deplorable, and I shared the observations made about those remarks by the Vice President and by the British Prime Minister. I share, of course. I don't, in relation to other things, the tail end of your question was about what race? Did you say race? Well, I certainly don't think he's a racist. If that's what you're inviting me to say, I certainly don't believe that.
The next question is second row here, Alan Dupont.
Mr. Howard, I'd like to just pick up on a question that Paul asked you about the character of President Trump. And he's often categorised as a transactional president, merely a transactional president. But there are other people who take the view that he does have substance and convictions, and perhaps the best illustration of that was with he's prepared to use these cruise missiles against Syria. Suggests to me that perhaps there's a moral dimension to Trump that a lot of people haven't picked up. So I'd just like to ask you, when you think about President Trump, clearly he is transactional in a lot of ways, but so is every politician, but what about the convictions, the substance of President Trump? What do you see as the defining characteristics in terms of substance?
Well, I was very encouraged by the sentiments in his speech in Warsaw. Now, it's only one speech, but it was a very eloquent defence of something that I'm quite interested in, and that is extolling the relevance of Western civilization to the kind of society we are. Some of you know I've become chairman of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization, and I thought that Warsaw speech was first class. Now you could say it should have been delivered somewhere else, but that's ephemeral. I thought it was. I thought the sentiments he expressed about children and babies, so forth, when he made his remarks associated with the operation in Syria, I thought they were genuine. And I think we would be wise to accept that the brush deal making locker room style may not be the whole man. That there's more to it than that, and we all know people who fit into that sort of description. The Australian term is rough diamond. Now I'm not saying that quite fits him, but I do think that there's a lot about his character we are yet to learn. And once again, given the position he occupies, given the authority he has, and given how important it is what he does and does well, we shouldn't jump to hasty conclusions. And there's far too many people, both in the United States and around the world, that are doing that. And I think and hope many of them are going to be wrong-footed in time to come.
I think the next question is over to my left, and then after that, a question in the front row.
Oh, hello, Mr. Howard. Sid Marr from The Australian. I was interested in your, you were talking about Mr. Trump and his behaviour as an American conservative. Could I get your view on your interpretation of Mr. Turnbull's interpretation of what's a liberal and what's a conservative in London? And while I've got you, you say you're more sceptical on climate change. Should Australia stay in the Paris Accords itself?
Well, look, on the Prime Minister has spoken for our country on Paris. We're staying in. It's irrelevant what my view is. He's made a decision. We're staying in, and I support that decision. You asked me, look, my views on the character of the Liberal Party are very well known. And the Liberal Party to me has always been the custodian of two traditions in the Australian polity: the classical Liberal tradition and the Conservative tradition. Let me say to people in this country who regard themselves as conservative, you are always welcome in the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party and the National Party are the natural and most productive homes for Conservatives in this country. Don't waste your time on alternative Conservative iterations. They will end in tears.
And the next question in the front row.
My name is Sarah James. I have a question about Russia. In the United States, there is a special prosecutor who is investigating what possible ties there might be between President Trump's team and Russia. Of course, as you know, the intelligence agencies in the United States believe that Russia was involved in hacking, and now there are questions, including recent emails with the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. What are your thoughts about the Russia situation and what's unfolding there, and how does it affect your view of the president and the future for the relationship of the two countries?
Well, I'm following the issue very closely, as I guess most people are, and again, and I'm not trying to seek refuge in this response, but it is much too early to jump to any conclusions in relation to it. And plainly, some of the stuff that's been raised in relation to contact between the administration and the Russians, particularly after the election, is ridiculous. I mean, there was criticism that an attempt was being made to establish a back channel with the Russian. Well, back channels have existed for the beginning of time, and I seem to remember that a back channel in 1962 probably did more to avert the Cuban Missile Crisis becoming a disaster than anything else between Bobby Kennedy and the then Soviet ambassador. Now, I know there's talk about what went on during the campaign. Now, I mean, I can understand why that is being investigated, and I can understand the interest in that. But I am going to suspend judgment before I even try to answer your question. I just think it's irresponsible for somebody. I mean, I don't hold any authority, but I once did a bit, so I don't think there's anything to be achieved by my saying this or that about that at this stage.
Next question, the gentleman to my left in the second row.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. My name is Vilas Dar. As you can tell from the accent, I am an American. In many ways, you have been very gracious in your assessment of the American presidency, but the way that America leads around the world is based not on the office, but rather the individual who occupies it, and the full faith and credit that people give to his words. Now, as we think about many of the international leaders that are now willing to openly criticize the President of the United States, to speak to how he does no longer speak for the world at large, what does that mean for how individual countries approach the sort of global marketplace?
But you made the comment that you no longer speak for the world at large. The American president, in my lifetime, has never been able to speak for the world at large. At the best of times, he's been able to speak in a sort of extreme situation for a collection of countries of common values and views. But American presidents have been subjected to criticism by people from like-minded countries in the whole of my experience. And this is part of the rush to condemn. It's more than a rush to judgments, it's a rush to condemn. Now, I know some of his style is, I accept that some of his style is provocative, but in the end it's what he does that matters. And I think it is far too early to be joining that rush to condemn. Okay, we didn't get 20 people agreeing on climate change at the meeting in Hamburg. Well, that was an inevitable consequence of the Americans pulling out. I don't think the rest of the world, the other countries, are going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. I don't think they are, but equally I don't think the Paris Agreement is going to have such a long-term beneficial impact on the climate of the type that has been claimed in relation to it.
Now, I saw a hand in the air in that direction. So the next question over in that part of the audience. Thank you.
Hi there, Mr. Howard. Hi, thank you. Family, long-time supporters of the Liberal Party, thank you. My name's Nick. To what extent has it played a role in the evolution of the political happenings the past 15, 16 years, even perhaps back to Mr. Bush? How can Australia and the rest of the world learn from the way that the media has impacted in the political outcomes and the
Could you just ask that last bit again? I just didn't catch it, I'm sorry.
How has the mainstream media and other media sources influenced the political happenings and the dialogue?
So it's the relationship and role of the American media over the last 10 to 15 years, and I guess in particular in relation to Trump, how that's interacted with the political system and politics.
Well, I think what's happened in the United States, and it's happening to a degree here, the media have become greater barrackers for different sides of politics. I mean, one of the beauties of cable television is that you can see it all, and it was no surprise, of course, that the President's son did an interview with Sean Hannity, and equally it was not surprising that Hillary Clinton in the lead up to the campaign did likewise with some of the more friendly networks in the US. I think we have seen the media in both our country and in the United States become more aligned with different points of view, and I think that has had an impact. I think there's a greater tendency now for people to switch on their program of preference and have their prejudices reinforced. I think that's happening to a very significant degree. Let's face it, we all do it, and you've got this variety now, and I think that's a good thing. And you've not only got it with, say, Sky and the ABC, but you've also got it with the international. I mean, the range from BBC World and CNN and Sky UK through to Fox. And if you can understand French, the French media and Al Jazeera, and although it's in a bit of trouble at the moment in the dust-up between the Gulf states and Qatar. I think it does matter, and is having an impact, but it's something that we just have to deal with. And we've got to understand that the media have different influences on different populations. And one of the big differences I was always very conscious is that the proportionate impact of talkback radio in this country is infinitely greater than it is in the United States, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. I can't speak with any authority on Canada, but I know quite a lot about the political systems of those other three countries, and I can tell you talkback radio has a vastly greater influence here than in any of those other countries.
Now, I'll take two final questions. A question from the gentleman there, who's had his hand up for some time.
The lady too.
And then the final question over to my left. The gentleman here, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. John Paulson's my name. One of my concerns is about truth. And if you look at our Western political system, usually what brings a politician down is being found out in a lie, whether it's taking a bottle of wine or having an affair or something like that, and that brings the politician down. With the way Trump has behaved over the last period, truth seems to matter less, to the extent that it was important before, and I'd appreciate your views on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm as pessimistic as that. I do think that one of the real tensions in political coverage now is between the yearning for serious debate and long-term vision and long-term plans, but the continuation of the gotcha mentality. And I've seen the gotcha mentality operate in relation to both sides of politics, I suppose. If I'm honest, I'm a little more open-minded about this in the last 10 years than perhaps I was in the previous number of years. But I find it hard to accept that our current group of politicians are fundamentally neglectful of the truth. I think there were things covered up and distorted years and years ago, to at least to the same degree as perhaps you believe they are now. I think one of the important things, of course, is to always recognise the role of the media in exposing this. I mean, I'm a great believer in a free media. I think there are only three things that will keep this country democratic: a vigorous parliamentary system, an incorruptible judiciary, and a free media. If you have those, you don't need a Bill of Rights or anything else. And I do think we have
That's Howard's law. That's Howard's law.
That is Howard's law.
I've heard that many times.
I'm glad to hear you have, Paul, because I think, but I do think the role of the media, and because this carries with it a responsibility for very careful analysis, and that goes without saying that not all the media is capable of that. I mean, it's a very mixed bag, the media in Australia, as it is in the United Kingdom, and certainly is in the United States. But so far from there being a greater concentration of media, and this is not a commercial for News Corporation, but so far from there being a greater concentration of media now, I think it's far more diverse and far more fragmented than it was when I entered Parliament in 1974. I mean, you had two very powerful newspaper groups, and you had free-to-air television at that stage, which didn't really set, still at that stage did not dominate political reporting in this country, and you had the ABC. I think you've got now, of course, the talkback radio people are far more influential now than they were in 1974, and I don't see any likelihood of them declining in influence, and they're probably more influential here in Sydney than in other parts of the country, but they're very influential in Victoria as well. So I'm a little more optimistic. I mean, you are right to draw attention. I mean, everybody is accountable. And we live in an age of transparency and accountability, and the media are right to keep our feet to the flame, but I'm not quite as pessimistic as I think your question implies.
Now, we're running a little bit over time, but I will take that final question that I indicated, the gentleman across to my left, and then that's it.
Hi, Mr. Howard. My name is James, and I was wondering, what do you think of the US military presence in Darwin?
What's your view of the US military presence in Darwin?
Oh, I'm strongly in favour of it. I wouldn't mind if it were larger. No, I don't mean, but no, I look, in case you thought from some of my earlier remarks that I was unduly critical of the former president, on one of the few occasions I've sat in the House of Representatives since I was entitled to sit there as a member for Bennelong, and the Liberal Party finally found in John Alexander a decent candidate in Bennelong, was to hear President Obama's speech in which he announced the rotation, it was something that was arranged with the Gillard government, and I thought it was an excellent arrangement, and it's something that should be encouraged, and if it needs to be expanded, then it ought to be expanded.
Good evening. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Bailey, and I'm the chairman of the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney. I won't take up much of your time this evening, but on behalf of the board of the centre, I'd very much like to thank you for attending this evening's event. We have a sellout crowd this evening, which we're very pleased with. It demonstrates that not only the interest in the topic, but also the quality of the speakers. In light of that, I would like to extend a sincere vote of thanks to both former Prime Minister Howard and Paul Kelly for headlining tonight's discussion. There is no doubt that this evening we have been privileged to be able to listen to some very discerning thoughts. It's tremendously beneficial to hear considered and nuanced assessments about the serious issues that we are confronting in relation to the US and our relationship to it, compared to the somewhat more abbreviated views, i.e. 140 characters or less, that are very often too easy and too convenient to be informed by. Paul, you are what I'd like to describe as a national treasure or the gold standard of journalism. Amongst the bombardment of opinions dressed up as irrefutable facts that must be accepted as truth from many sections of the press, and I'm not referring to fake news, Paul's unique style is to ask as many questions as to make statements. He encourages his readers to engage in their own thinking and reason rather than just accept what they have read and heard. This is a very powerful antidote to the polarised world we currently find ourselves in. I wish there were more Paul Kellys in the world of journalism. Thank you, Paul, and we really appreciate your presence here this evening. To John Howard, I cannot say much about John that has not already been said and is well known, but I will say this. John is uniquely qualified to provide informed perspective about the current US administration. Amongst the many, many other things, a few of his qualifications and attributes are, obviously, it's well known he served 11 years as Australia's Prime Minister. I think our average since 2007 is about 2 years per Prime Minister. His political career in the federal parliament spans 7 US presidents, from President Richard Nixon to George W. Bush. And I think one of the major achievements of his government was the signing of the US-Australian Free Trade Agreement. that was negotiated and enacted while he was Prime Minister. Lastly, and by no means least, his government provided the means to the American-Australian Association that enabled the establishment of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney in 2006, for which we are very grateful. I think from this evening's discussion I will remember a couple of things. The emphasis on substance over style. Let's cut away the emotion and let's look at the substance of what the Trump administration does, not what they say on a daily or hourly basis. So I think, John, we are very appreciative of your willingness to participate in this evening's event and also your significant contribution to the Australian-US alliance. Thank you. I just have a small gift to both of you. We call this our US Studies Centre medallion. And if you'd stand up, it's just something that we like to leave
Thank
as a
you.
memento
That's very
for
kind. Thank
our,
you.
Participants. And on the reverse of it, it sort of gives our tagline, which is analysis of America, insight for Australia. And that's the role that we see. And I think our photographer just like
Yes.
just hold them forward.
What? You want some? Yeah. Here it is. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much, John.
Just tonight's event highlights the Studies Centre's ability to engage and host key speakers and to participate and influence debate about the Australian-US alliance at a critical time in our relationship. This follows on from the significant speech that Senator John McCain gave here in Sydney at the end of May as a guest of the Centre. It is through events such as these that we will continue to fulfil our mission, which is to educate Australians about the United States. This mission has allowed the Centre, during its 11-year history, to educate over 7,500 students, author more than 1,000 journal articles, research reports, opinion pieces and books, and convene in excess of 1,000 events with tens of thousands of attendees. As part of our research activities, next month we'll be launching, in conjunction with the American Chamber of Commerce, and Niels Marquardt, the CEO, is here with us this evening, a new research report examining the investment flows between Australia and the US. The United States is the single largest source of investment in Australia and the single largest destination of outbound Australian investment. The project examines the value and economic impact of these investment flows in a multifaceted approach. It will be a very, very valuable contribution to the dialogue between and about the US and Australia. I don't think it is a contentious view that our trade agreements and our supporting our close economic ties and our security treaties with the United States significantly underwrite Australia's prosperity and peace. The Centre will continue to primarily focus on these aspects of our relationship, thereby acting and benefiting in our country's national interest. I look forward to the Centre continuing to play a significant role at the intersection of the American-Australian alliance and relationship, providing a lens through which Australians can view and learn about our closest ally. For those who have not had enough but can't get enough about the US and would like to learn more about our activities, I direct you to our website, www.ussc.edu.au, to sign up for events and to subscribe to our publications. Like our weekly newsletter, the 45th, focusing on weekly political events in America. And in fact, topically, next week, the Centre will launch a paper authored by CEO Simon Jackman, Impeachment 101, the history, process and prospect of a Trump impeachment. I was just talking to someone before, I think it might need hourly updates, but to make sure you get a copy of this, please visit our website and subscribe. Again, thank you for coming, and please have a safe journey home.
Oh, thanks, mate.
Got my